6, 5.
Hello once again, everyone. I welcome you to the last session of the day before the evening party begins. Our next presenter needs no introduction. He is very well known among the VWBPE crowd. Kevin Phelan, Corrimal, and Second Life is the founder of Rockcliffe University Consortium, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to the development of virtual technologies for collaborative learning, knowledge, and scientific research. Please help me welcome Kevin as he tells us how to think different. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Letty. So let me start off very quickly. Here it is, we're 10 years of Second Life later, and people are still asking the following questions. Why Second Life, and why virtual worlds for education? And to me, the answer is simple. It's because these types of virtual environments force us to think different. So Thomas Kuhn identified the connection between language and paradigm by showing the way we describe problem sets and how it limits our ability to identify new solutions to problems when we lack the language to describe the problem in the first place. This is not a matter of thinking differently by looking at the problems through different lenses, but a matter of how to think different by forcing us to reevaluate the way in which problems are described in the first place. This presentation is going to be about how to think different. And while there's going to be a fair bit of theory, maybe some of which is new, probably most of which you've heard before, essentially what I'm going to do as part of this presentation is draw a line of logic that shows you why it's important that we think different and how it is that we can potentially get there. So to start off with, I am going to have to apologize. I do not have the presentation written out in advance, and unfortunately, I do not have a speakeasy set up. So just to let you know, we will do a transcript of this later. But as part of this one, I don't have a transcript for this, and a transcriptionist is not available for this presentation. So just to give those people a heads up, and I do apologize for that. So let us begin. What does it mean to think different? And if we look at this whole idea of knowledge and the general proposition of what is truth, the idea of justified true belief, we come to this realization that what we believe is true and what actually is true are quite often two different things. And to a large extent, this problem is exacerbated by the fact when you look at something referred to as a Gettier counterexample or Gettier problems, where we look at something and we say, is something justified to be true? Is it true? And is it believable? Right? Therefore, it represents knowledge. We then get into these situations where there's all these different examples in terms of, I have a quarter, today is Saturday, and it's raining outside, therefore every time, therefore next Saturday it's going to be raining. If it happens to rain next Saturday, that's not truth, that's not knowledge, it's not understanding. It just happens to be a series of coincidences in which justified true belief happens to exist. But it's not knowledge, it's random chance. So what's really going on? What's really happening here? Part of the issue is that as individuals, we have these root beliefs that are sort of hardwired into our brains. And there's a very biological reason for that sort of to occur. That as we start to accumulate knowledge, as we start to accumulate understanding, the way in which we perceive the world around us, our brains sort of help us rationalize things in terms of saying, well, okay, I met a cute blonde a long time ago, therefore all blondes are cute, and if I happen to come across a blonde woman or what have you inside the future, then I will probably give her more attention than somebody who might be a redhead. we make these types of bias and value judgments all the time, and it's not that we don't rationalize the fact that the logic that got us there is totally skewed, misplaced sometimes, but more in terms of the fact that in order to get by our day-to-day lives, we have to establish a lot of these root beliefs that allow us to basically make snap decisions on the fly that basically says, do I understand this? What category does it fall into? Do I understand this class of object? Is it going to hurt me? Should I fight it? Should I flight from it? And this is how we survive. This is what makes us different. So there's a philosophical rationalization in terms of what we do in our everyday lives. And there's also a physical and psychological connection in terms of how it is that we process the idea of what is true, what is knowledge, and what isn't. So where does that bring us? What it does is, to a certain extent, it brings us up to this idea of paradigms. And I mentioned at the top here that if we look at The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, which is a book by Thomas Kuhn, and yes, I realize I'm going back a fair way, but that book still has as much standing, as much insight today as it did when it was first written over 30 years ago. Paradigms are not about thinking differently. It's not even about thinking different. It is about describing a problem set using a consistent language for a consistent culture or subculture, a group of stakeholders, if you will, that sort of get together as a group, as a social network, and say, this is how we're going to describe these particular types of problems. And as a result, this whole idea of a paradigm in terms of coming up with new solutions, most of it is really based upon this idea of how you define the problem in the first place. So if you define the problem in terms of everything being a nail, then all your solutions are always going to be a hammer, not because you didn't think differently or think different about the problem, but because that is what you have been ingrained to understand and to believe. Right? This problem is a nail. Right? If you can see past that to understand that this problem is a nut, now all of a sudden that opens up your world in terms of the number of different solutions that are available. So, so we have a couple of problems when it comes to thinking about problem sets and the language in which we use to define this. One of which is the fact that quite often, because our social groupings are fairly narrowly defined, we have this idea of a silo, and that a lot of our problems a lot of our explanations are really silo-driven. Right? And then we have other things that sort of influence this in terms of this idea of externalism or causation in terms of why things occur, and the internalization of this information and the rationalization of it, which sort of leads us to using these root beliefs that we have come to understand, including all their biases and everything else, in terms of what is justified and what is true. So to a large extent, the idea of a paradigm is, and I apologize, I'm going to have problems with this word, but it is epistemologically constrained. I apologize that you can see the word above me. Hopefully somebody will understand how to pronounce it correctly. But we have this idea that knowledge is constrained, and it's constrained not only by language, but it's also constrained by social context. So let's talk about language for a little bit. And specifically, the fact that competence is really inseparable from language, however you define language. So really, when we're talking about this, the idioms that we use, the nature in which that we go to describe problems, really becomes a limiting factor in terms of how we define paradigms. So the social constructs which are socially acceptable really is what tends to derive whether or not we belong to one culture or one subculture, or what have you. If you are an English speaker, there is a whole pile of idioms that we are used to having grown up with, in which we understand the stories, we understand the meaning, we understand the backgrounds. If you try to translate those into Japanese, for example, or Chinese, Mandarin, then there's a whole different set of idioms, and there's a different way, literally a different way of thinking, because it's hardwired. Again, we're getting back to this root belief type thing. It's hardwired in terms of how it is that we perceive those idioms and what the meanings of those idioms are in relationship to what is justified and what is believable. So we form these symbolic associations with every type of class of object that we deal with. And as a result, when you combine that with a social structure and with a language, then we start to get into this idea of observed or observable formalities, in terms of the fact that as a society, we have certain expectations and norms. And if you go beyond those boundaries, then you are the black sheep. You are the one that's being difficult. You are the one that is trying to, upset the apple cart. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy upsetting the apple cart as much as the next person. But, there's only so long you can do it before you become ostracized from the society that you're involved with, that particular group. So, if you are an M theory specialist, right, you're not really going to be, involved a lot with people that espouse other beliefs, such as, X number. My apologies. There was another group that I was thinking of, and of course I'm going to butcher this as well. But there are different fields of physics in which M theory has its corresponding subcultures that it is clashing with at all the time. And so, which group are you socially acceptable to be in? A lot of this comes down to a question of power relationships and the reinforcement mechanisms that sort of bind those societal forces together and say, okay, you are now part of the club. You're admitted. Here's your badge, right? And that becomes very hard. In the common vernacular, we call it groupthink. And it's a challenge, because when you want to think different, one of the first things that you have to do is you have to break that cycle of dependence of the social cultures in which you are already firmly embedded. So it definitely becomes a challenge, right? So language also does something else for us in terms of this idea of the social constructions of reality. As a member of a community, right, with a language and everything else, idioms and everything else that goes along with it, participants are both the producer and the consumer of a brand of truth. Right? And it's not to say that truth is truth, but there is certain knowledge that is inherent to belonging to one society, one culture versus another. Right? If you are a Protestant, you believe something very different from if you are a Catholic. If you are a Mormon, you believe something quite different from a Jehovah's Witness. Right? So we have these different feedback mechanisms, the three most common of which are this idea of traditionalists, where values are based on natural law, moral order, realism, this whole idea that things are fixed and immutable, and they will always be that way throughout time. Then we get into the idea of modernism, which is the reevaluation of traditional values in a modern context, right? So fashion does this all the time, in terms of, something old is new again. How many times have we heard that expression? And then there's this idea of postmodernism, where we deconstruct the social forms associated with the other two. And we start to break this down in terms of, why is modernism more beneficial than traditionalism in terms of certain areas? So, again, when we take a look at this, a lot of this comes down to a question of reinforcement mechanisms of the social social constructions based upon this idea of authority and the legitimacy of the authority that binds that culture together. And all of this is influential in terms of how we think about truth and knowledge, and the way, in order to think different, we're going to have to do something different. So, essentially what we end up with is, and I sort of like this little image because I love the idea of fractals, right? Because it really sort of shows that what we have many similar realities that all coexist together, and they all have their version of the truth. They all have their version of what represents knowledge. but it's very much based in terms of this idea of multiple cultures and subcultures coexisting, each of them dynamically searching for an equilibrium between authority and legitimacy amongst all the other little bubbles that are out there of subcultures. Right? So what really tends to happen? Well, when we're talking about this idea of knowledge, what we're really talking about is we're talking about these different bubbles of social constructions of reality, trying to adapt to the pressures from all these other bubbles of these cultures and subcultures trying to get you to change, and by extension, how you are trying to influence the other cultures that are out there that in fact they're wrong and they should see things from your point of view. So there's this cooperative and adversarial type system that's always in equilibrium with one another, where not only do we have this concept of how we interact with inside our own subculture and the knowledge and idioms and every root beliefs and everything else that goes along with it, but then we also have this holistic approach in terms of, well, how does that influence across everything else? So, this is very much a, chaos in motion type of view of what really knowledge is and how important it is to really sort of, if you're truly believing in something, if you truly feel it's right, sort of sticking to your guns. But if you want to change your beliefs, if you want to think different, it's not as easy as just basically saying, look, I'm the teacher, I'm going to present you, here's calculus, and I know this is the way we taught you how to figure out the area of a circle before, but this is the new math, and this is the way you should be thinking about things. Just because there's the old method and the new method doesn't mean that people are going to get it, right? And so that becomes very much of a challenge, right? So this is where we start to get into this idea of the evolution of knowledge creation. And I love this little diagram. There's a number of diagrams that I love from this author, a researcher named Nonaka. And I apologize, I can't remember how to pronounce his first name, but he's developed a number of models of the evolution of knowledge and knowledge creation. And I love this particular model because it really to me, gets to the heart of what's sort of going on when we're talking about how to think different, right? So essentially what we're talking about is we're talking a cyclical process between tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge, and the way it develops, and the fact that there is actually a cycle to this in terms of socialization, where we deconstruct what it is we already know. We have externalization with individuals coming together to form small social groups, which is really if you extend that into the idea of modernism and how do we modernize those areas where we have deconstructed and we found things that are worthy of being different, right? How do we modernize this? How do we make it different? How do we think differently? Then combination of groups into organizations and larger components, getting more of a critical mass, so to speak, around what's going on. And now we start to get into this idea of realism in terms of, and this is going to sound really quaint, but I mean, not in terms of what's really going on here, but in terms of, can we make broad sweeping statements in terms of the applicability of what it is that we've learned through deconstruction and through the externalization of this information, so that we can generalize this and use it in a very practical sense, right? So the last portion of this is this idea of internalization. And this is really where knowledge and where root beliefs really change, right? It's the restructuring, the internalization of this information, where you take everything that's come before, from an organizational, from a group level, from small group levels, and you start to internalize it, and you start to look at it and say, wow, that's different. I never thought of it that way before. This is the light bulb effect. This is where you take a look at something and say, my God, how did I not see that? I've been staring this in the face. How did I not see that? And everybody gets it. Doesn't matter what age you are. This is lifelong learning, carries on through to the day we die. But when we look at this transcendental process, what we're really talking about is we're talking about moving towards or away from a given culture or subculture. I used to think that M theory was the right theory that we should be looking at. Maybe we should be looking at things in terms of other aspects of quantum mechanics. It's a matter of getting to a point where we say, something, should I really be changing those root beliefs? And unfortunately, that's not quite as easy as we make it sound. Because in all honesty, the idea of a root belief is the fact that you don't have to think about it. It's automatic. When you drive into work each day, you're on automatic. Most people don't remember the drive into work. We don't pay it a second thought unless something happens, right? Because we're on automatic. It's become ingrained. It's a root belief. It's a mechanical process. And yet when we talk about knowledge and truth and the way we interact with the world, this is the level at which we're trying to get at when we want to think different. When you are thinking differently, then what are you really doing? What you're saying is that, well, my root belief is one thing, but I understand that this other thing is really the way things are, therefore I need to think differently about that subject. When you think different, you don't have to think differently. It's automatic. You know it. And it becomes part and parcel of everything that you do from that point going forward. So there's some other components to this, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail as we go along, but there's other components that Nonaka refers to in terms of areas that influence knowledge creation, including vision, driving objectives, blah, 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 blah. We're going to come back to this diagram. I'm just showing you this very quickly here to show you that the system in which we develop knowledge is a lot more complex than just simply presenting information. We look at practices in terms of how things are done, dialogue in terms of why things are done. There's a shared context. We have to look at our knowledge assets and the capital that's available there, both from an individual perspective, a tacit perspective, an explicit perspective, and a social perspective. And this is where we start tying into some of the things that Virtual Worlds brings to the table. So I'm not going to give all of that away right at the moment. We're going to come back to that in a moment here. So critical thinking, right? This is really what it is that we're trying to get at. When we're talking about thinking different, we're really talking about how do we engage this critical thinking process. And unfortunately, this is one of the things that schools, and schools don't necessarily always do well. Schools are good at providing information for teaching people how to do things. But a common complaint when you get out into industry is, I have these wonderful people that know how to do things, but they're not problem solvers. Well, what's going on here, right? Because if, the whole reason why we've survived as a species is because people used to have to think critically. And now as a society, we are so much on autopilot that we just assume that everything is going to be done for us, right? What is the stimulus behind having to be critical thinkers, right? You don't like something? Oh, the government will do it for you, right? Oh, I need somebody to look after my kids. Oh, school teachers will do that for me. It's, we have these changes in the way that we have perceived our social network, which are not necessarily the healthiest things for us as we move forward, but have just evolved naturally because we have, to a certain extent, we've sort of lost our ability to critically think about things, and then we've lost the desire to take responsibility as a result of those things that we think critically about and the solutions we come up as a result of that. So there's a few things that I just want to touch on here in terms of critical thinking, right? Is that there's an external portion to it and there's an internal portion to it. And on the external side, we're looking at things such as open systems and open environmental scanning. What is it that we have in terms of evidence through observations? What can we feel? What can we touch? What can we smell? What can we quantify, right? The metacognition level of this, right, when we're looking at how do we work with this type of stuff, it's all through regulation. It is all through a question of how do we categorize this information? How do we put this into something that is very explicit that we can then work with and we can derive results from there? So on the explicit side, we're looking at things that are very objective, hard facts. right? Things that can't be sort of disputed. And to a large extent, from the social context, this really sort of goes towards the authoritative side of what it is that we're doing within, say, these cultures and subcultures, right? What is it that we can put down as a fact that justifies that our little social, our little culture, subculture bubble has more authoritative reasoning behind why it should be the way it is. Then we have the internal side, and this is where all the internal stuff sort of comes from. So the rationalization, the way we deconstruct things, the subjectivity in terms of why we believe things are the way they are, and then how we, through language and symbols and organization, how we look at legitimizing the authoritative perspective in terms of why our subculture is the way it is, why it should continue, and why it should be influenced or influencing other people. So where does this bring to us to? This brings us to the idea of discourse analysis. Because again, we started this off by talking about, in order to think different, you have to use language differently. It's all about language, right? So we really need to focus on these ideas of behavioral and verbal communications. This idea in terms of body language, this idea in terms of social structure, this idea in terms of what we're talking about, the way we talk about, the idioms that we use, the connections to everyday activities, and how we describe that, how we pass on, how we share the magic of those particular things with our student charges, right? I can't tell you the number of people that I have run into who eventually get to the story of, the reason why I'm in this particular line of work is because this teacher or this professor or this coach turned me on to that particular activity. And, while, this whole aspect of mentorship and the language and the structure that goes around with it, the stories that are told, is just so important, because we build up this whole emotional connection to not only to our the little subculture that we're in, but also to the way that we feel about it. And I don't have to tell anybody in the room here how powerful hormones can be when you're really trying to establish a connection with something, right? So when we're looking at this, we're not just focusing on the discovery of spoken and written language, but we're also looking at the way behaviors play into this, and the structure of the language, and the way we tell stories, and the way that we encourage or we describe people in terms of how we're trying to get to a particular point. And that has, people who do this well have so much magic around them. I mean, you take a look inside Second Life here. You take a look at, as a matter of fact, there was yesterday over in Cloud Party, there was a little exhibit that they have over there about Edgar Allan Poe. And it's really interesting. I mean, if you get a chance to go over there and take a look at it while it's still there, go take a look at it. But it's really interesting. It's not substantial in terms of what's there. I mean, but the way they've laid it out, just in terms of the structure and the narratives and the verbal, the idioms that are used, by Edgar Allan, what have you. I mean, it just elicits an emotional response while you're there. And so this is very, very powerful. So when you want to think different, a lot of this is about deconstruction, right? Deconstruction of discourse, of the analysis. And what we find is that there's a number of different things that we really should be looking at, especially in terms of curriculum development, which sort of taps into these things. So what types of languages and narratives are you using that form ideas of cohesion, of coherence, parallelism, speech events, right? Different things that, quite often there is, a specific way of being in terms of certain things. A rocket scientist has, different, the way they tell, even down the level of the way they tell jokes, the background events. the commonalities that they share, right? There's so many different things that sort of go into this. And as we're going through and we're planning out course development, and as we're trying to engage from either, direct learning or directed learning, or from the idea of apprenticeship, right? How do we convey all of these linguistic ideas and behavioral ideas that really are going to turn the student onto a new way of thinking, right? And in such a way that they want to embed that as part of their root belief system. I mean, this is not always simple stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's all kinds of primers out there that you can use in order to develop a course curriculum, right? And so the structure of it is, I hate to say paint by numbers, but sometimes it's paint by numbers. But those teachers that get it, those that go beyond the structure, really what they're doing is they're tapping into these particular elements. They're tapping into that whole idea of, where's the magic, and how do we really convey that to the student? How do we encourage them without going over the top, so to speak? Not that I would ever go over the top, but so these particular types of things, and bringing them into the course development and bringing them into the classroom. Now, part of this is also this idea of cooperative learning strategies, right? And bringing this idea of cooperative learning strategies into the classroom as well. None of this is new. Everybody within reason does this to a certain extent. But I think what it is that we're sort of seeing here is that, something there's a little bit more to this than just simply getting a bunch of students together and having them work on a group project, right? If we're talking about how to embed this idea of the knowledge creation cycle along with this idea of socialization, externalization, and combination of things, what are we really looking at? Well, in small group interactions, right, this social context, and that's important because knowledge quite often is a social construction, right? It's not just an individual thing, but it's also a social construction. How do we embed those components of language, the authoritativeness of why that language is important, the realism in terms of the practical idea of what people are going to get out of this, looking at the dialogues, looking at the practical applications? How do we use these ideas of socialization, externalization, and combination in order to develop cooperative learning strategies? Right? So we're not going to worry about internalization because to a large extent, internalization is the responsibility of the student. So, that whole yes, grasshopper, you will learn type of thing eventually. That is the responsibility of the student. As an instructor, as a guide, as a coach, as a mentor, you cannot lead somebody to think different if they choose not to internalize the information, and there's no amount of preparation that you can do to remove that responsibility and accountability away from the student. But what we can do is we can focus on the other 4 areas of the learning development cycle, right? And that is where we either capture their imagination or we don't. So then comes the next piece of this. So that's part of it. I mean, putting them inside group situations is all well and good and wonderful and what have you. But now we get into this idea, and I'm going to recycle something old, hopefully make it a little bit new again, this idea of work is play. And this is where I want to drag back into the Nonaka's knowledge development cycle, because what are we really doing here? As the instructor, we're responsible for the socialization, the externalization, the combination of the way we structure the program. But then if we also bring into this concept of work as play, and we involve the student as part of the other components of the knowledge development cycle, the shared context, the vision, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? The ecosystem in which it is occurring, right? If we provide a series of knowledge assets, and essentially then walk up to the students and basically said, look, there's no boundaries. I will structure this portion for you, but you need to tell me what's important for your shared context, and let's figure out a way that we can play with this back and forth, so to speak. Right? This whole area, everything that we're doing here in Second Life really sort of taps into this whole idea as work as play, because what it allows you to do is to provide some structure in terms of the group interaction, but then have the student become accountable and engaged for the other half of what it is that really creates and develops knowledge, right? Which is, this vision, the ecosystem, the shared especially the shared context, and where the student becomes engaged in those particular activities. Now all of a sudden they build that emotional connection with the knowledge that quite often is lacking when the instructor tries to do all of this for them. And this is where environments like this become extremely important, because what environments like Second Life, Cloud Party, OpenSim, EVE Online, Minecraft, Club Pet, take your pick, right? The virtual environment doesn't matter. What matters is the emotional connection that you have with that shared context that really is going to connect with the students. And so half of curriculum development is getting the students engaged with that particular set of processes. Right? So, oops, my apologies, we went one slide too quickly here. So this whole idea of emotional attachment, the driving objectives, clear articulation of the specific culture or subculture that is being driven towards or away from. So the little diagram that we have above my head here, what are we trying to do? Well, we understand that the student is part of one particular culture in terms of how they are envisioning, how they believe the world to be. And so the question becomes, well, what are we driving them towards, or what are we driving them away from? Is it here, there? Is it this? Is it that? And if we have no clue in terms of what we're doing, then how can we expect the student to develop that emotional attachment to where it is that we're trying to direct them towards? Right? So there has this idea of a clear articulation of the specific culture or subculture that is so vitally important in terms of our curriculum development. It's not simply enough to put the information in front of the student and say, here, learn this. Right? There has to be that sense of belonging, because as part of trying to strip down the root belief system, which is the core of the difference between thinking differently and thinking different, if you do not tap into that, you have lost the battle. Plain and simple. Right? And there's no way of getting around that. Right? So, and that's not an easy thing to do. Essentially, as instructors, coaches, mentors, what have you, one of the hardest things that it is as part of that particular job is to address the idea of fear, stress, and anxiety that comes when you are trying to break a core root belief that somebody has and replace it with a more holistic, a more beneficial root belief that is going to bring them to where it is a more healthier place in terms of where they need to be. And this is why I refer to this idea of the cycle of addiction. Because when we are teaching students, what we are essentially doing is we are trying to break that cycle of addiction to their root belief system through all these other mechanisms that we've talked about up to this particular point. Right? So what is the emotional trigger that causes people to fall back upon their old belief system? What is the ritual that is involved there? What is the language that's being used? And in a lot of cases, students, especially K through 12, young students, are an open book. They're just sitting there and they're just sort of like, all right, feed me, just keep coming, more knowledge. And it's a very easy thing to do with children, right? But it gets harder as those root beliefs become more ingrained. This is part of the reason why older adults have more difficulty accepting newer ideas, because those root beliefs, which are hardwired. They're physically a result of the way our brains function. It's very difficult to break those particular types of things. And in order to break a root belief, you have to essentially look at it in the terms of how do we break an addiction to something that is not healthy, right? So we're looking at this idea as part of our instructional development that we have to deal with issues as part of the classroom experience on the fear, the stress, and the anxiety of changing the way we do things. Like I said, it's not a matter of thinking differently. It's a matter of thinking different. And those are two, I'll say this again, this is two very distinct concepts. And they have two very different physical and psychological processes associated with them in terms of how people interact depending on which one of those two that they're using. So we need to look at things such as, are we making information overly complex? Is it ambiguous? Is it unclear? Structural inadequacy, right? This is, all right, we're not going to talk about Viagra here, but I mean, in terms of structural inadequacy here, we're talking about this idea in terms of, when we go back and we look at engaging the student as part of the shared context. That's structural inadequacy. If the student is not engaged with that, then it's going to result in fear, stress, and anxiety, plain and simple, right? Because the student's going to be sitting there going, why should I care? What's in it for me? How is this going to make my life better, right? So we get into these problems where we have, if students don't start to develop new patterns of behavior, right, and new language and new social constructions of reality, the result is that inevitably we get to this conclusion that the student is going to fall into faulty decision making, role conflicts, potentially role overload in terms of trying to put people into positions that they're not qualified to hold, right? And as a result, those students are going to fall back into classic coping mechanisms that are directly the same as those people dealing with problems of addiction, right? It may not appear like it on the surface, but when you boil it down to its essence, that is essentially what is going on. So let's come back to the topic at hand, which is where we started this. Why virtual worlds? And if you take a look, and I'm going to do something that's very specific here, if you take a look at the forums online, what you'll find is that as a result of this announcement earlier today from Linden Lab talking about the reintroduction of the 50% discount, there is a whole series of people that are on there that are talking about this idea of, well, why the heck are we even doing this in the first place? I mean, has this not passed its prime? And I would tell you right here that notwithstanding the technology, right, the concept of what it is that we're doing here, this whole aspect in terms of why virtual worlds are important is to a large extent because it allows us to tap into those aspects of shared context, shared responsibility, shared accountability. We have control, we have variety, it allows cooperative play, right? And there's no preconceived culture in terms of what we do here. We have a blank slate to play with. So you don't get a lot of the drama when you're doing things with inside a virtual world that you would get if you tried to do the same thing in a real life environment. Because as soon as you try to do something in a real life environment, all of a sudden all those other cultures and subcultures which confuse the issue start to get in the way. And now you have to not only deal with the learning objectives of the student, but now you have to deal with the external equilibrium pressure of all these other subcultures that are trying to interfere with what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And you don't get that inside a virtual world, whether we're talking about Cloud Party, World of Warcraft, whatever. You simply don't get that here. You can boil things down to as close to their essence as possible with inside a virtual world. And that is extremely powerful when it comes to trying to educate people and trying to get them to change and try to think different. So essentially, I'm sort of going to leave it there at this particular point in time. I mean, this is the essence of my argument in terms of why virtual worlds are important and why and how we should actually be looking at utilizing these things in order to think different. Hopefully, there has been a fair bit out of this that you guys have been able to get out of it. And, for the last 10, 15 minutes, we'll open things up to questions. Okay, well, if there doesn't seem to be any questions at this particular point in time, so, I'd like to thank everyone for allowing me to be here and for giving this particular presentation. I have been asked by the establishment to let you know that at 6:30 there is going to be a social, and let me just grab the information here because I believe I do have the website up here. Here we go. There is actually it's on right now. It started at 8 o'clock. There's the evening party with DJ Deary, and they have blues music going on over at the VWBPE Gateway. So hopefully we'll see you over there. Actually, Buffy has a question here, and so I'll just reiterate this. The only question I have is, where do you think we will be 5 years from now? I think we're going to be in a much better place 5 years from now. There's another theory of knowledge development that I have, which basically suggests that certain pieces of technology take time for critical mass to develop within them, and virtual worlds happens to be one of those particular technologies. While virtual reality has been around for quite some time, it has really been with the advent of Second Life that it really gained any real popular movement. And that was back around, it was 10 years ago, right? 2003. So essentially, when we start looking at different changes in technologies, what we find is that we have cycles anywhere from 12 years to 16 years in which a technology is first introduced to the point where it really becomes sort of socially acceptable. And from my point of view, virtual worlds hasn't reached that level of maturity yet, and it will probably start to reach that maturity around 2018, 2020. So where are we going to be in 5 years from now? I think at that particular point in time, we're going to have the tools inside this environment because people are working on them now. People want this technology. They want to use this. The problem is we don't have all the tools. And when Linden Lab stopped being a lab and started being a profit center, everything came to a dead stop, right? So, maybe there might be a little bit of extra work that might have to be done. But in general, I think, in 5 years from now, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more in terms of these virtual technologies being more integrated into what it is that we're doing. I think we'll have much better tool sets, and I think that you'll find that this particular type of environment will have a much larger following, that we will actually start to see the beginnings of critical mass developing inside these particular environments. That's not to say this environment, in terms of how it's structured right now, there's a lot of growing up that this environment needs to do. But if different organizations put the time and effort into these particular platforms, I think that there's going to be a huge potential for this come 5 years from now. We have another question here. In terms of changing people's thinking, is it more important to focus on students or institutions? Students, far and away, students. Institutions are simply an aggregation of a series of cultures and subcultures that really are a life, they're an organism unto themselves. What we're talking about is we're talking about the development of social groupings and how we move students from one social group to another social group. While institutions are part of that in that they provide an example for people, institutions in effect are a culture unto themselves. And since those cultures really can't be moved, again, in of themselves, because it takes, 1,000 actors to move one particular culture or subculture. You really need to sort of do this one student at a time, and I don't think there's any substitute for that. These groups that go out here and say, "Oh, we're going to reach, even MOOCs and what have you, that we're going to go out and we're going to reach and we're going to influence 1 million people this year." Yeah, well, something, I'm sorry, but it still boils down to one person at a time. No matter what you do, it's still an aggregate of individual actions and an aggregate of individual root beliefs, and there's no other way to approach it. Right? Now, you gain critical mass, and you've changed the institution, but I definitely feel it's more important to work on the students. What aspect of virtual world instruction design elements, or user experience do you think we could include more often or enhance? Certainly the engagement of the student with inside the shared environment. Having the student take on responsibility for part of the instructional design process, such that they have, maybe not necessarily to the level that you as an instructor would do this, because obviously as an instructor you're expected to have far more knowledge of how this works than the student does. I'm not suggesting that we turn students into instructors, but certainly getting our instructional design to the point where we create real options for students to basically control the direction of where that learning goes. So, when we have certain activities that we do, not just saying, well, we have one way and only one way that we can do this, to have a range of options for them and to allow the student to control the direction that goes in. Now, that means a little bit more work on the part of the institution and on the part of the instructor, but I think what you'll find is that the students will actually become more engaged and will have a greater sense of ownership over the information that's trying to be presented to them. M. Skytower has a question. Do you think educational organization will return? If you mean to Second Life here, I don't know. So we're going to do a little bit of a very quick side topic here for a moment. So the introduction of the Linden Lab 50% discount that has occurred is very interesting in the fact that I think Linden Lab has sort of realized the importance of nonprofits and education facilities in order to bring people into the environment. Certainly, if you look at the concurrency numbers, they've been dropping all the way along, and that's because while education maybe only formed 12% of the Second Life population, it was a well-coordinated and a well-structured 12%. And when you own 12% of the market, you own the market. And as soon as they got rid of that 12%, all of a sudden they got rid of the largest stakeholder that was driving people into using this particular environment, right? So it was the most, and please don't take this the wrong way, but it was the most moronic move when they did this in the first place. And now that they're trying to bring this back, I think probably what they're going to find is that the issues are a little bit more complicated than just simply offering a 50% discount. Now, having said that, I think it's a huge step in the right direction. I cannot see it not being a step in the right direction. So as Joey was saying, smart move by Linden Lab. But it's not going to solve the problem, because part of the issue that has now occurred is we now have 3 to 4 years where instructors and institutions have basically said, well, if Linden Lab is going to do that to us, we're going to look at other alternatives. And now they've invested money into those other alternatives. 3 years is a lot of time to develop a lot of infrastructure around those alternatives. And to have people abandon those to come back to something that hasn't evolved, 50% discount or not, that's going to be a bit of a hard sell. I think in the short run, because there was another question that came up, not here, but before the talk that we had here, there was another question that came up in terms of, well, why the heck would they do this, in the middle of the summer? And to a large extent, it's also sort of like, well, why not? No time is really going to be good for educators, and that's because there's 3 separate cycles of business process that needs to come together concurrently before you're going to get any type of market momentum in this space. And one is the curriculum cycle in terms of instructors developing their curriculums for the following year. The other one is the financial cycles in terms of when schools and educational boards participate or create their budgets. And there was a third one. For the life of me, I've forgotten the third one right at the moment. But essentially there's a number of different things that need to come together at the same time. Now that they've introduced this discount again, I think in the short run, there's going to be some minor movement in terms of what's been going on, and it's going to take a year before we actually see the results of what that 50% is going to mean. So, ask us again in a year. So I'm just taking a look for the questions. Joey mentions our confidence needs to be won back. Absolutely, right? And you don't take a beating and then just come back and suck up to the person that beat you up, right? So there's some give and take that sort of needs to happen on both sides, but where we go is a question of, is this a matter of this is the only stick that's going to be offered, or is this a question of this is the first step towards a wider dialogue that is really going to address the needs of education and nonprofits within inside the environment? I'm hoping it's the second one. I really hope it's the second one, but that's going to depend upon a lot of things coming out of the lab over the next year, and I'm really hoping that this is a sign of some good things to come. So now that we've addressed that, let's get back on topic here. So thinking different. Yes, potentially. The real solution is beyond both SL and OpenSIM, and absolutely at this point I think it is. Right, but time will tell. Okay. If there's no other questions on the primary topic, I think what we will do is we will close this particular session at this point. We are coming up on the hour, and this is being recorded, so I want to make sure that we do close off within the hour. I'd like to, again, thank everybody for having me here. And if you want to stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes after, then we can always continue the conversation. But for this particular point, I think that wraps it up. And there's 2 more days to come. I invite everybody to, there's some fascinating discussions that are coming up. Tomorrow we're going to be in Jocadia Grid, and there'll be some interesting presentations there. And then Saturday is a huge day in Second Life here. We have a ton of presenters, and you absolutely do not want to miss out on the program that's happening on Saturday. So looking forward to seeing everybody as we, get through the next couple of days. And again, thank you all very much.